All right, everyone, welcome to our webinar this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Andrew, and I work in marketing here at SecurityMetrics, and we're grateful to have all of you joining us this morning. Our presenter today is David Ellis, and he's the Vice President of Investigations here at SecurityMetrics. He has a lot of experience in forensics, and he also holds the credentials, as you can see on your screen, GCIH, CISSP, QSA, and PFI. So we'll be looking forward to hearing from Dave. And also with us today, we have John Bartholomew, who is our SVP of Technology here at SecurityMetrics. He's known as JB around the office here, and we're excited to hear from him as well. We'll hear a little bit more from him as the presentation goes on, and he will also be joining us for our Q&A session at the end of the webinar.
To start, just a quick disclaimer, when we give statistics, that'll be from the totality of the investigations from last year. Anecdotes usually will come from last year. They might reach back, the year before that if it's an applicable kind of thing. So with forensics and predictions, I want to start off where we left off last year to see how we did on those predictions. To set the stage for that, I want to begin with a quote from Maury Haber. He's the CTO at Beyond Trust. He said, "There are three jobs in this world where you can be completely wrong all of the time and still not have to worry about being fired. One is being a parent, another is a weather person, and the last one is a technology trends forecaster." So with that in mind, the first prediction that we made last year is that e-commerce breaches were going to continue to increase, as would attacks against healthcare. Now, the reason for that was because, or the reason for that prognostication was that the United States was just getting into the EMV technology, and the assumption is that as it became more difficult for attackers to grab credit cards from point-of-sale merchants, that they would shift their attention to e-commerce, and that did bear out. 80% of the PCI-related or credit card-related investigations that we performed last year were e-commerce. That's almost a complete inversion of the statistics from about 4 years ago, where about 80% of our PCI investigations were point of sale. Number two, the smaller merchant breaches will come under greater scrutiny. Now, this prediction stemmed from the industry's a change they made several years ago. 5 or 6 years ago, the card brands kind of softened their mandates so as to not overly burden financially a small merchant with high costs of a forensic investigation. Prior to that, though, virtually every merchant that was suspected of being a victim of a data breach was mandated to have a forensic investigation. So if you owned, a mom and pop shop and you had one terminal and you got breached, there was an investigation. But that's not really the case anymore. The card brands have fairly high thresholds before a mandated investigation will be required. And what happened I think in the shadow of that was that smaller merchants kind of fell off the radar for a little while. Now, it wasn't that they weren't getting breached, it was just that not a lot of attention was being paid to them. Their banks were kind of put in charge of overseeing and getting them, getting the problems rectified. We have moved into the arena where that wasn't happening. The merchants weren't self-remediating, I think, well enough. And now, while I can't get into specifics, some of the card brands are beginning to require small merchants to now prove that they are investigating and remediating these suspected breaches. The third one, okay, the truth is our stats didn't prove out this one to have actually increased yet. And that's the coordinated attacks that begin with your cell phone. Attacks against individuals are going to increase, I believe, because the cell phones tend to lead to so many other potentially juicy things for the attackers. Number 4, passwords may not be the security that you're looking for. Now, when I gave number 4 and number 5 last year, I did say that these might not come to pass during 2018, but they are coming. And the truth is you'll see at the end, I'm going to shift these down into the latter part of this year's as well. The groundwork is being laid for the AI and the point number 5, which is the intelligence, and where I see this one going is computers basically launching the attack or being designed to attack a system and then being designed to change its attack as the environment changes. On the security side of that, I envision that that we will employ computers to defend against computer attacks that are AI based. So I don't think we're quite where Hollywood's going to jump in yet and say, yeah, the computers are controlling everything. But as far as computer security, I do see AI playing a role in the future. I kind of skipped past passwords. We're going to talk through those a little bit more later in the presentation. But password cracking technology has escalated immensely. Let's just leave that for there, and like I said, we'll cover it a little bit later. I reviewed this last year, but I was asked by some of those attending today to include it again, so we'll go through it a little bit quickly, but I did add a piece to how hackers hack, how they pick their targets. In short, they begin by scanning the internet for open remote access ports. They brute force credentials with using an online password list. They will start with something. Well, let me get back to the scanning the internet. So imagine, you come home from work and your side job is as a hacker, and so you go to your computer and you tell it to run a port scan across, let's say, 500,000 IP addresses, and then you go to bed. You wake up in the morning, you're having your coffee and you pull out the paper, and then you're glancing at the results of your port scan, but you're specifically looking for a couple of open ports, something like 5631, 5632, because if those ports are open, the attacker knows that LogMeIn is being used in that environment. And so he then goes, oh, okay, well, let's say I want to log into this, and my credentials are going to be administrator, and then I'm going to try to hack the password. If administrator or admin is a username that would allow them to get into this LogMeIn, he's halfway there, and all he has to do at this point is discover the password, which is becoming increasingly easier for them. Then they're going to test the remote access credentials. If they're successful, they gain access into the system. And it's not until this point that they actually know where they are. It's been extremely anonymous. But they get in and they determine, oh, this is a merchant, this is a healthcare organization, this is a corporate environment. There might be something in here that I want. And so they're going to sit and monitor your activity. They might install a keylogger, a memory scraper, things along those lines. But they're going to sit and monitor, and they may download other malware onto the system, and with the eventual goal to capture confidential information, healthcare records, credit cards, corporate secrets, anything that they can turn around and sell. Now, the next part is how they're going to use this and how they capitalize. They use stolen credit cards to buy prepaid credit cards, gift cards, make online purchases, or they go onto the dark web and they sell them in bulk. And this is one of those things where the bad guys go in and buy a block of credit cards, and they go online and they start purchasing things. A little while ago, my Visa card apparently made a trip to Australia without me and purchased a set of golf clubs in Sydney. So that's where that happens. Here's a clip that we took from an ad using the Tor, the Onion router, and getting into the dark web. And if you go through that, you'll see that credit cards will sell from anywhere from $20 to $100 on this particular sites. Other sites I've seen, credit cards can go for virtually 50 cents to maybe $1. You can see from that previous slide that where credit cards sell for, and it's easy to see how they capitalize credit cards that they capture. For healthcare organizations, the revenue is a little bit different, but it's interesting. It's kind of an escalating thing. A medical insurance ID card will go for $1 or $2. Medical profiles will sell for $5 and up. The value to a hacker for healthcare documents is that the data from the ID cards and this medical data can help them obtain other documents. It can help them apply for and get a driver's license or other government IDs. Those types of things then can be sold for usually $170 to $250. Adding on to this, a completely farmed identity containing a full set of PII, personally identifiable information, and healthcare data. Often it's created from the details of a deceased individual. That will sell likely for $1,000 or more. In ransomware, the last point that I'm going to get on here, the thing to remember here is that that this is an attack on the system where they're not, well, at least they're telling you that they're not capturing your data. They're just freezing your data and making it unavailable to you. They usually demand a ransom and encrypt some form of cryptocurrency, and then they promise to provide you a decryption key once you transfer the Bitcoin over to them. Experience is that they follow through with giving you the decryption key between 2/3 and 3/4 of the time. One problem sometimes seen is that the provided key doesn't always work perfectly. It only decrypts some of the files. It's corrupted. Additional work has to be done. One last way that they make money through ransomware is on the dark web. There's a service called Ransomware as a Service. And it kind of provides easy to follow instructions for an attacker to capture information that, or to capture details on how they can then launch their own attack. It's kind of like the novice hacker being able to stand on the shoulders of someone more talented and benefit from the technology work that they have done. So what's new in hacking trends? The thing that we saw last year that was a little bit different, and this is also especially true in the HIPAA space, service provider and payment processor investigations. Attackers now more than ever are targeting specific entities that they are going to attack because of the desired payload. So before, when I was describing the steps to you, it was very anonymous. Now it's, in these situations, we're finding that they are willing to do their homework and go after a specific organization because they know at the end the added work will be worth it because the payday will be larger. Now, this has always been the case for hacktivist attacks, where they attack a particular corporation because they want to make a political statement. But now what we're seeing is that they can't resist the bigger paydays. They're willing to do all of the extra work. They'll do social engineering attacks. They'll study everything they can about a business, medical facility, etc., so that they can craft legitimate-looking emails to try to capture user credentials. This process might take months, but they're not up against the deadline, so they'll work however long it takes. In other words, in these cases, it's just not random anymore. So with that, what did we see in 2018? What were some of the trends? The first, I kind of alluded to earlier, is what changes have EMV made, with its advent. Now, just a quick explanation of EMV. This is a technology which replaces the use of the mag stripe strip on the back of the card, which the mag stripe contains data, contains the card number, it contains the card holder's name, the expiration date, and CVV information, and it's unchanging. What is coded onto that mag stripe stays on that mag stripe, so that when an attacker was able to steal the card data, they would get everything that they needed to replicate another card, and then they could sell that card 100 times and make plenty of money on it. The chip that is now, or the little computer chip that you see on the credit cards, that replaces the communication with the mag stripe data by interacting with the point of sale terminal and creating a one-time transaction code that if an attacker were to capture would be useless to him, because again, it's a one-time code. If he were to try to replicate that and use a card in some other location using that same transaction code or a made-up code, he would just get a denial. Excuse me. So with EMV making a hacker's life more difficult to capture usable credit card data, the attackers were going to have to become better at attacking elsewhere, such as in the e-commerce side, and they did just that. Attackers discovered that if they could alter a payment page to say no longer, or not divert data, but to copy it, and there were some attacks where attackers would divert the data. Those would get flagged pretty quickly, because when a system stops working, the owners of the system want to know why. But in this case, just copying the data, they found that such an attack would be more difficult to spot. And the reason why it's hard to spot is that typically e-commerce sites will utilize a tool called file integrity monitoring to alert them if any of their critical files have been changed. So that file integrity monitoring does just that it's looking at a critical file and says, hey, this has changed. Somebody needs to tell me whether this was supposed to change. The problem is that in the case of a shopping cart, or a database for that matter, you have a highly dynamic environment, an environment that is naturally changing a lot. So file integrity monitoring doesn't work there inherently. Excuse me. So what we looked at is, out of all the e-commerce investigations we performed last year, about 80% of them have modified payment pages. If you had a tool that could monitor slight alterations to a payment page, that would be a pretty useful tool. Hopefully a little later this year, we'll have more to say about that. So ransomware, it was the big thing in 2017. How, how is it evolving? Well, about 30% decrease in total ransomware attacks in 2018. So in 2017, ransomware was the most prevalent attack, certainly in the healthcare environment. About 60% of the healthcare attacks in 2017 involved ransomware. That fell off a little bit last year. But what we saw with ransomware is that it became much more sophisticated. It did fall to the 6th most popular attack method. It was replaced by crypto miners, which have also fallen in popularity in the last 5 months. Banking Trojans. Adware, spyware, and other types of backdoors. The successful attacks showed an increase scrutiny in targeting their victims. Kind of like the last point that I was bringing up earlier about them being willing to do more homework. The victims of choice, as I mentioned, were healthcare organizations, followed by businesses and the public sector, city, state, and federal government. Attackers recognize that these kind of entities can't afford to be down or inoperable for very long, and they have the ability to pay. There were businesses like Allscripts, LabCorp, and Boeing that are the Boeing aircraft plant in South Carolina that were all successfully targeted last year, as well as the cities of Atlanta and Baltimore, just to name a few. The ransomware that had infected them was sophisticated. It was usually polymorphic, which means that it changes slightly each time that it's loaded, so that it's very good at evading antivirus products. According to Sophos, 75% of organizations infected with ransomware were running up-to-date endpoint protection. Case in point on that is the Colorado Department of Transportation was infected with 2 variants of the SamSam ransomware just 2 weeks apart. So they had one infection, they remediated it, and then because it had morphed a little bit, they were infected again. And why does ransomware hang on? Well, part of its decline was because more and more entities were just refusing to pay. That said, the SamSam ransomware alone netted over 6.5 million US dollars last year. So while they are declining with revenue like that, it's not likely to go away anytime soon. One big change that we saw, or increased change last year, was an increase in service provider attacks. Successful attacks against service providers actually doubled from 2017 over 2016. They doubled again in 2018. Attacks against service providers are especially dangerous because the potential impact is on numerous other unrelated businesses. A couple of service provider investigations, immediately come to mind. In one, it was a credit card processor. It suffered a breach, but it self-discovered in a fairly short time. But even in the quick time that it did discover and remediate the situation, about 150 of the merchant clients were also breached as a result of it. Another case was an industry application vendor. They provided a web interface for a specialized type of business that allowed their online customers to place orders, things like that. They suffered a breach that resulted in the attackers then installing malware on the systems of more than 450 separate businesses. So this is when I was mentioning before that attackers are now targeting specific businesses because they know the payday at the end can be, exponentially better than if they're just breaching one business. Now, I'd like to share one last example. Sorry here. Oh, no, I apologize. I'm having trouble with your computer because I need to get my cursor back here. Sorry, I changed computers, and he uses his screens differently than I do. All right, so the one that I wanted to share is a case where not so much the number of businesses that were breached as a result, but the things that went right. In this case, the client was a point-of-sale hardware and software provider, and one of the employees' access credentials were stolen. The attacker then monitored their systems until he gained remote access that he needed to log into the service provider's entire clientele base. And after doing that, he immediately installed malware capable of capturing credit card accounts. There were about 250 businesses in the service provider's portfolio that were infected. The good news is that about 95% of the merchants had already employed P2PE, which is a point-to-point encryption. And our tests validated that all of the merchants that had employed the P2PE did not suffer any data loss whatsoever. So only 5% that hadn't got on board yet. So it was a nice test, a nice validation of the value and importance of P2PE. Some of the things that were the most common problems, frequently employees, like the last example, it was an employee who had their credentials stolen. I'm not going to go down that road deeply right now. We're going to hit it a little bit later. Also, the insecure coding we'll talk about in a minute, as well as third parties. The BYOD, that's bringing your own device. I think we're going to see companies starting to lock that process down a little bit, because the problem that it creates is, let's say you work in a highly secure environment. You take your laptop home, you log into your home network, which probably doesn't have the security protocols that the internet at work has. And I'm not saying you personally, but this individual visits sites that you probably wouldn't be comfortable visiting in your work environment. And as a result, some malware lands on his or her laptop. He goes back to work, logs in at the corporate environment, or the hospital or wherever, and lo and behold, the attacker now has access into this environment. It's a frequently repeating scenario, and it's going to require a lot to remediate it. It's going to require a lot of training, and I think we're going to see companies start to tighten down or create rules that may not allow you to take your work laptop home, or something along that line. Lastly, insecure remote access remains on the horizon. We've talked about this before. The importance of on remote access is to ensure that you have multiple factors of authentication in place, and we'll talk about that in more detail as well. So, how did the breaches happen? What caused it? What were the most key vulnerabilities? We'll go through this kind of quickly. No firewall, improperly configured firewall, meaning that their rules were not quite sufficient. In one case, we examined, I was going through the firewall rules, and they had several, I can't remember, 18 or 20 pages of firewall rules. And well down through it, I find the rule that says allow any to any. And what that meant effectively was that everything they had written prior to that was now null and irrelevant, because it just opened up the firewall. Little tiny things along those lines that the coder just missed when he was putting it in place. Other points of failure, default passwords. Not, when a company comes in and sets up the merchant environment or whatever environment it might be, they usually have default passwords that are used, and if they're not changed, the attackers can easily gain access to them. When an attacker can walk into a restaurant and he sees like NCR terminals, goes back and he's trying to hack in, and he knows the default passwords for NCR or micros. He knows that the micros default password is M, the number 1, C, 0, and $, if I remember right. They're all available online to them. So that's the most important part. The other part about passwords is the lengthy, and that they're not in a dictionary anywhere. Other key points of failure: antivirus was inadequate. It either wasn't updated or it wasn't pushed out to all of their endpoints. They would have it on a server, but they wouldn't have it on terminals, on user desks, things along those lines. And let's see. In this one, the biggest key point of failure for not uniquely identifying the users is user sharing login credentials, because what you tell one person and they tell somebody else, and pretty soon it gets out. I've seen them, passwords written on stickers next to the devices that that are in public view. I also mentioned earlier authentication passwords that include, if you have a username, admin or administrator, I highly recommend you change it. Having your administrator, and if his name's Robert, you put Robert as the username, that is going to be harder for an attacker than if you leave administrator as a user profile. And then the lack of multi-factor authentication, again, that continues to be one of those things that we're catching up a little bit, but businesses have a ways to go. With that, there's a thing in IT security. A lot of times your focus is on compliance. In the credit card industry, you have PCI. You have the payment card industry data security standards that you need to be compliant with. Healthcare organizations, you have HIPAA, and you have OCR overseeing that. You have, in government entities, there's FedRAMP, or businesses that do business with government, has FedRAMP to comply with. So there can be times where compliance and security collide with each other a little bit, if your focus is too much on the one at the expense of the other one. A case in point on that is there's a merchant. I can't give too many details away on it because I don't want you identifying them, but large merchant, hospitality industry, and in this particular instance, about 900 of their locations were affected. What happened is they were required, because of their size, to have an annual audit on site by a QSA. So the QSA, who had done their audit in previous years, arrives on site and they say, hey, we've employed point-to-point encryption. And so now the scope is only the card data environment, right? And the QSA says, well, yeah, but you don't want to, only look at the card data environment at the expense of the surrounding environment if there are vulnerabilities there. This merchant was adamant that the QSA was only to evaluate the point-to-point encrypted card data and immediate card data environment, and would not allow him to comment on anything of the surrounding technology that was in place. Well, what happened is this merchant ended up getting hit with ransomware. Now, no card data was ever lost. The P2PE was doing its job in encrypting and rendering the card data unusable. But the ransomware attack froze up the merchant. They didn't have backups that they could swiftly restore from. And that's kind of the key to ransomware, is if you have backups, make sure that you test your backups. Your backups should not be connected to your immediate environment, because we've had cases where the merchant says, yeah, we have backups, but they're encrypted by the ransomware as well. Offsite backups aren't bad, just basically disconnected from the network is the most important part. But anyway, in this case, it took this merchant 3 days to restore their systems, and 3 days spread across 900 locations where they couldn't take any credit cards, equated to millions and millions of dollars of lost revenue. Excuse me.
Somebody thinks your voice has been hacked.
Yeah, kind of thinking that way. So I wanted to add a specific thing looking at HIPAA attack trends this year. In evaluating the state of security within the healthcare industry, I came across the Healthcare IT News and pieced together a number of articles regarding healthcare data breaches last year. Here's just some of the headlines which give a hint about what happened. 3 phishing hacks breached 20,000 patient records. Let's see, data breach affecting 75,000 in the federal ACA portal. 2 phishing attacks breached 21,000 patient records. Misconfigured database breaches med-call advisors. 3 Massachusetts hospitals fined $1 million by OCR. 5 breaches cost $3.5 million for national provider in the HHS settlement. And it goes on and on and on. Healthcare organizations tend to have a few attributes that make them attractive targets for attackers. They often have legacy systems that aren't regularly updated, making them a little easier to attack. Now, often that's not directly their fault, as they may have embedded systems that, due to the way that the manufacturer created them, they can't be easily patched. If the healthcare IT department were to do so, it might cause problems with the way the vendor can support them. The critical nature of the services that are provided in the healthcare industry puts them in the sights of the attackers. Health data is an essential commodity, and it makes it a valuable commodity in the criminal world, and subsequently a target for theft. With respect to ransomware attacks, hackers believe that hospitals, medical practices, other healthcare organizations, that they're going to feel that they're putting lives at risk if they can't access patient records, so they're more likely to pay the ransom. Those are just some of the things that I kind of wanted to put out there so that the healthcare organization understands, one, why they're coming under attack, and then what the attackers do with the information. We talked about that before, the value to the attacker because of how they can sell or escalate the data that they acquire there. Now that brings us to tips to avoid being breached. Employees are seldom very far away from attacks. Going back to the healthcare side, one of the increases that they saw last year is that in 40% or 42% of the cases, insider involvement was suspected in the loss of the healthcare data. So more often, though, the employee involvement is one of omission or lack of understanding. They fall to phishing. They fall to social engineering. Things along those lines. So there, hopefully you will be training your staff to recognize, if they see people in their company that they don't recognize, challenge them. Ask for credentials. Other of the social engineering type would be the phone calls that come, after hours by the person identifying themselves from anywhere from the custodian to telecommunications representative or an IT tech, a representative from an application provider, anything along those lines.
Dave, can I insert a question here?
Yeah, please.
So I had lots of comments last year from franchise groups, and it became obvious to me that if you are part of an organization that is a franchise or a satellite of some group, and you're running the same or similar system to dozens or hundreds or thousands of other locations, and if they get into an organization and understand the management structure, the key software pieces, the key software components, the method of operation, that anytime they do that in one location that's similar to yours, all of these things, are we seeing that type of thing as well?
Yeah, that's, you bring up a really good point. Because of the consistency that's across the environment, that is usually mandated from the corporate side, and the franchisee owner may not have any choice on the systems that he has installed there. And we had one case where a guy goes into a restaurant, and he walks in, he just probably had dinner, I don't know, but he observed the terminals that were being used there. Goes back, looks up a phone number for all of
Other locations.
all of the other locations, and several of them were disparately owned by one franchisee owner might have owned 3 or 4. In this case, he ends up calling, I think, 28 of them, and he poses as a service provider for the point of sale terminal, and says, you know, I have to do some system maintenance. Could you put your manager on the line? You know, and he directs the manager to go back to the back of house and sit down, and he talks the manager through to open up a VPN for him, and then he, you know, covertly installs malware. Now, the good news is 20 of the 28 managers that he spoke with asked for further credentials and didn't allow him in. The bad news is 8 did. And so, yeah, the consistency does give the attacker the ability to, you know, it's like, hey, yeah, I called this one, it didn't work, I'm going to keep going. And in this case, he got 8 paydays out of it.
Yeah, and I heard the same comment. I heard comments that social engineering attacks had increased. I was talking to a franchise that had thousands of locations, and they're saying, we're hearing this all the time now.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to go through the rest of the slides fairly quickly to get leave us a few minutes for some Q&A. Some of the other problems that we saw consistently that could have been remediated or prevented would have been applying of patches more timely. There was a vulnerability in a payment application that the patch came out for it almost 2 years ago now, and we're still seeing businesses get breached as a result because they haven't applied the security patches or the subsequent updates. Vulnerability scans, penetration tests, it's great to hire somebody from the outside to try to hack into your systems. Pen tests, I think, are unbelievably valuable for that. Logs, the importance of logs are that you have somebody looking at them. We had one where we did an investigation. It was a large customer. I think they were in the 800 plus stores, and they had been breached for 9 or 10 months. Millions of credit cards were ultimately at risk. The sad part of the sad commentary was that as we dug into it, we saw that they had a file integrity monitoring and an IDS system in place that flagged the breach the day that it occurred, but nobody was watching. So if you have these tools, file integrity monitoring, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, have those alerts go to somebody and have it in their job description that they're required to look at those alerts every day. If this particular merchant had looked at those alerts, they could have shut it down on day one and avoided millions of dollars of losses in consumer confidence and in fines from the card brands and on and on and on. Passwords, going back to it, passwords should be complex. They should be changed regularly. Minimum 8 characters. I really prefer 12. I prefer that they mostly contain disparate special characters. They should be required to be changed every 6 months. They shouldn't be anything that could be found in a dictionary of any language. And with that said, the site right here, haveibeenpwned or pwned.com, you can type in a password, and you don't have to type in any of your other information. You don't have to put in anything identifying your email or whatever. This is just going to do a text search to see if the password you typed in has been found in any of the recent data breaches that exposed passwords. There's about 500 million passwords in the database. I did mine. I've got 4 or 5 passwords that I use regularly, and 2 of them came up and 3 of them were okay. I highly recommend that you do that. And everything I just mentioned here, they should be changed. They should be complex.
Dave's would that be an okay point to talk about the technology increases in breaking passwords?
Okay, yeah, I'll put this out real quickly. The technology in breaking passwords has exponentially increased over the last 2 years. The manner in which they're doing it is a little bit different. It's not a brute force of the password itself. It's a brute force of the password hash, which leads to the password.
Right.
And
so they already have to have broken into the system somehow to get to the hashes.
Right.
But then they can get everybody else.
Yeah. And to tell you where the technology is, there's a system set up in Sweden right now that's pretty advanced. It's liquid cooled. It's, you know, you probably spent $1 million on it, but it can go through billions and billions and billions of hash iterations per second and can virtually discover every potential keyboard combination of potential passwords in a matter of several hours. Now we've built a similar system here at SecurityMetrics. Well, similar. That's generous, but I think we spent about 7 or 8 grand on it, and we can search over 1 billion hashes per second. So going to the, you know, the prediction that I had mentioned earlier is that passwords, they may lose their efficacy as a security measure, but for the time being, you know, hackers aren't using liquid cooled, you know, password cracking technology right now. So, you know, do your best to avoid the problems at this point. Restrict access to on a need-to-know basis. You know, your SVP might think he needs, you know, access to all your systems. He probably doesn't.
Question on the password about not saving in web browsers. The same tool that allows for breaking the hashes, or similar tool, is also putting at risk, if they get into your system, all of your subsequent passwords saved in a browser.
Oh, that, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if it's saved in a browser, it's saved with a hash, and it's just going to look at the hash and break it. So yeah, if you've got 10 passwords in there, it'll get them all.
So once they get into your system, one way, if you have every other password and user ID saved, they're going to own that. In fact, it's actually pretty fast.
It is, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. So last couple on this, network segmentation. You know, if you think back to the TJ Maxx hacks, or Max hack a few years ago, their entire corporate across the entire United States was protected by a single firewall, essentially. It was one perimeter. So what we're talking about here is have multiple firewalls to create a safe zone for your most critical information. If you store sensitive data, and most everybody has to, encrypt it, tokenize it, hide it. Don't make it so easy for the attacker. If he gets into your system, at least then he has to worry about if he can decrypt your critical information. And do the same with your backups. As I alluded earlier, test your backups if you haven't, you know, so that you can restore your system if need be. If you know, if ever you know, everything hits the fan and you have to you know, nuke your system and rebuild it. If you haven't tested your ability to do that, you may find that it's a lot more difficult than the service provider described it when he sold you the backup technology. Lastly is incident response plan. Have a plan in place to know how you're going to react in the event of a suspected breach, and then test the plan. The importance of testing a plan is so that you can test your response to it when none of your critical assets are actually at risk, and then train everybody on it. Do desktop training. There's companies that can help facilitate that can come in and put on some training so that you can actually see what would I really do. Okay, let's see. We just talked about testing, so that ends with predictions.
One last that somebody mentioned that you would always mention, but you're trying to hurry through, is multi-factor, particularly for remote access.
Yeah, so multi-factor authentication includes not just having to enter 2 different passwords and 2 different usernames. It's 2 different ways of saying, yes, you are JB, and yes, I am Dave. So it usually begins, the first factor would likely be a username and a password. The second factor is got to be something else, something you are, something you do. So it could be like a biometric, a fingerprint. Funny, I mentioned that. That's in my predictions. Or it could be a device like an RSA key, you know, generating, you know, so that you have to answer. Something is sent to your phone, you know, along that line, where it's something completely separate from the username and password that might have already been hacked.
Do you recall a single case where anybody who broke, you know, brute forced in, where multi-factor was used? actually broke past that. So, and some of that, they would have to do it some other way, right?
Yeah, the cases are limited, and it's usually because the other factor was also discoverable on their computer system.
Okay.
But typically, if it's, there was also a case, and it was in the healthcare environment where a dentist's wife's cell phone was hacked, and then the hacker eventually was able to get his cell phone, and then was able to eventually migrate from his cell phone to his laptop, and from his laptop to his work environment, and then he had the keys.
He had all the factors.
Yeah, yeah. Those are a little more rare, but if they can get your cell phone, that's a problem.
Okay.
So going into the predictions for next year, I was checking out a site that reported being able to grant users unlimited lives and coins, and I wanted to start with the first one: large-scale social media hack leading to massive personal data losses. So going back to what I was saying, checking out the site, my son was playing this game. It wasn't Candy Crush, but it was kind of along that line. It was a real popular, tablet game, and one of the other users said, "Hey, if you go to this site, you can get unlimited coins and unlimited lives to use in this game." So he tells me about it. So I go to the site, I look at it, and what they ask for is your email address associated with the game that you're using, and the type of device you're on, whether it's an iOS or an Android device, and then it says to get the unlimited coins and the unlimited lives, you just need to download 2 of the apps that we're offering here, and they offered 5 apps. And they said, we do this for 2 reasons. 1, to prove that you're not a robot, and 2, so that we can keep this service of providing you unlimited coins and lives in the game, so we can keep the service free. So I download 2 of these apps into a sandbox environment, and I look at them, and they're both VPNs. They are installing a VPN onto the system. So all of the kids, and maybe grown-ups, I don't know, out there are giving this hacker site absolute access to your device, and then those devices go home. They get on your home network. You Venmo somebody with them. It just, anyway. With that said, I really think that one of these social media hacks is going to lead to massive personal losses. Biometrics. Biometrics are being much more common. There's a lot of computers that your login is going to be your thumbprint. The data for, iPhones.
The face recognition.
Yeah, exactly. Facial recognition, all of that. Well, all of that data has to be stored somewhere. Right. And that data, if it's stored somewhere, can be then stored elsewhere by an attacker. I think we're going to start to see the first inroads into hacks of biometric data. Third, I think a cloud provider is eventually going to be seriously breached. We haven't seen that so far, and everybody's moving the data to the cloud for the added security. I think it's only a matter of time until that happens. Fourth, foreign nation states. I think there's going to be a lot more recruiting of legitimate employees in U.S. companies so that those employees can provide corporate secrets. They're coming under a lot of scrutiny from the government for hacking into our companies, and so I think that's going to be a workaround for them. My last one, okay, I kind of cheated. I put 2 in here, but it's just repeating the 2 that I had last year on passwords not being as secure as they used to be, and AI going to make inroads into both hacking and security. There we go. Sorry, I hope to get done a little bit sooner than that, but if we have a minute or 2 for a couple of questions, let's go ahead and take them.
There was a question regarding breach to identification timeframes. Grown, shrunk.
It hasn't actually changed much in probably the last 2 to 3 years. In that period of time, it shrunk a little bit from before that. We would see cases frequently where the hacker had been inside the system for a year, 15 months by the time we get there. We had cases this year where it was very swift, and that was a result of card brands or the entity themselves monitoring their systems much better. Card brands have become much more sensitive at being able to identify at-risk businesses based on fraud being reported to them. But at the same time, we still investigated a case that had been breached for 14 months before it was identified. So yeah, I think they're getting a little bit better, but a lot of them aren't.
So you talked about the increase of e-commerce and versus, so card not present versus card present. Are those, but you seem to have mentioned that the little guys are still getting hit.
Yeah.
So are we out of the woods yet on the small guy? It doesn't sound like we're out of the woods on the little guy merchant side yet.
No, by no means. Not the small e-commerce site or the small point of sale merchant. What happened is they're just getting less attention because the card brands have had to focus on the larger businesses. But the small merchants, they are still getting pounded. They're still kind of the low-hanging fruit. So in a lot of cases, the attacker doesn't have to do as much work for it, so he knows he's not going to get as big of a payday. But 1,000 small merchants is going to equal his payday for a couple of biggies.
Made comments about nation states.
Yeah.
Nation states versus organized crime versus hacktivists. Who are the? Do we have a sense of where the players are and if they're growing, shrinking, changing?
Nation states, the biggest offenders, probably no surprise to anybody, North Korea and China. The hacktivists, they're an annoyance, but they're not as big of a dollar threat on a large scale. They may pose individual issues to individual businesses. But that's not where the focus is. And organized crime, that is what's behind a lot of it. In fact, if you look at the organized crime organizations that used to run, drugs and guns and that kind of thing, the drugs have actually fallen to a much lower echelon in their organizations, replaced by internet-based crimes. Organized crime worldwide is making far more money on internet-based crimes than they are in narcotics now. If that kind of paints a little bit of a picture. So that's not going away. Organized crime is there to stay, with the internet.
You're not on the police side of this or the enforcement side so much anymore.
No.
But you have friends.
Oh yeah, and I stay involved. I'm in touch with the FBI.
Are they getting better? Are we catching more guys?
Yeah, we are, and there are more prosecutions, and the sentences have improved. 10 years ago, if somebody got convicted on a computer crime, it was considered a white-collar crime, and they might do 12 months in club fed. Now you're seeing 15 and 20-year sentences coming down for some of these hackers.
So, comments on the cloud. Why do you think we haven't seen a big one yet? Or what do you think they're doing well? I mean, I hear from the auditors that cloud is a cloud, which is a crock.
Yeah,
that's the wrong term because everybody says I'm in the cloud, I'm safe, and the assessors that we have running around here going, yeah.
Well, first, let me describe the safety that comes from the cloud is that your information is spread across multiple servers.
Right.
So they can't just hack one server and get all of your information. That's where the cloud gains its security posture. But at the same time, somebody coming into that environment may be able to, they haven't yet. I think it's coming. Be able to clone the entire environment. I'm just postulating on that, but that was why I threw that in as one of my predictions. I think we're, especially in the cases of some of the smaller cloud providers, it may not be AWS, but I think you're going to see it.
So a couple of questions to finish. One guy asked if we do speaking engagements, and the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. Both Dave and I and others tend to get around. We do our latest version of the live hack demo is still a crowd pleaser. and we've added to the latest version the hash cracking.
Yeah.
So with our machine,
that's kind of fun when you watch this go through 1 billion non-textual passwords in a few seconds.
Last, somebody asked about signs that you've been hacked.
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's harder and harder these days, isn't it?
There's kind of four or five ways that you can see that you're hacked. In one case, a waitress walks into the restaurant and she goes to the computer to enter in an order, and she sees the cursor moving on the computer, and she sees a terminal services window pop up, and so that was her clue. In other cases, hopefully it's your IT security team identifying it because they're looking at logs that concern them. It can be an outside administrator, such as a card brand, who says, hey, we're getting indications that customers have used credit cards at your location, and then their cards were subsequently compromised. So it can come from the outside. Probably the worst way to learn that you've been hacked is from, we call it Krebs is my IDS. To read an article that Krebs has identified you in a breach, or you turn on the news and you see that your business is listed on CNN. The very best possible way is self-identification and finding it soon. I think more to this question's point is, if your systems suddenly aren't doing exactly what you expected them to do, if they've slowed down for an unknown reason, that might be an indication of it. I'm trying to think of other,
well, those were all the
ways.
standard original ones, right?
Yeah.
System's not responding, and you got more software running on your system than you knew about.
Yeah, something along those lines. But typically, have an IDS, an intrusion detection system, have file integrity monitoring working. And outside of that, if you're in the e-commerce world, wait just a few more months until we get a patent.
All right. Well, thanks again, Dave and JB, for joining us today. We've had a lot of great questions come in that unfortunately we won't be able to get to on this live webinar. But we do note every question that comes in, so feel free to keep chatting those in if you have any final questions. We do take down every question, and we will respond to you personally over the next week or so to make sure you get your question answered. Again, we were recording this session, so we will be sending out this slide deck along with the recording of the audio and the presentation today. So we will be sending that out to the email address that you used to register for the webinar. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll hope to see you again at another future webinar very soon. Thanks. Bye.